What if I told you everything that you knew about tires and tire pressure was wrong? Those numbers on the side of the sidewall, those actually have nothing to do with performance or going fast on a bike. And the things that we do to a tire to make it feel faster actually make us slower. You probably wouldn't believe me, so that is why I enlisted the help of an expert.
So I'm Josh Portner, and I'm the owner and president of Silka. I'm also an engineer, a background in aerospace, automotive, bike racing, all that good stuff.
Josh is the guy that helps riders like Peter Sagan and Fabian Cancellara dial in their tire pressure for huge events like Paris-Roubaix.
When the wind's out of the north, you want to be a little bit on the higher side of the tire pressure so that you can be in a better spot when the break happens, knowing it's going to come probably in that paved section.
So in this video, we're going to go into all the myths and misconceptions about tires and tire pressure. We're going to talk about things you wouldn't even consider, like negative spaces between different types of asphalt.
The wealthier an area you're in, the denser the new pavement will be. As you spend more money, you're typically using finer stone particulates.
And Josh is also going to give us tips on how you and I, just everyday riders, can dial in the perfect tire pressure. And before we get started, if you enjoy videos like this, consider supporting the channel via PayPal and Patreon. It really helps us create interesting bike content that no one else is doing. So with all that said, let's learn about tires. I can see where, a new rider might make the wrong assumption of what a good tire pressure is, partially because the tire doesn't help you out. Like there's a recommended tire pressure.
Right.
Do you know where the recommended tire pressure comes from?
Yes. So in a very strictly speaking, the tire pressure on the sidewall of the tire is 2 times the pressure, or is 1/2 the pressure it would take to blow that tire off of a rim. Mm-hmm. In a lab test run by a group called ISO, used to be called the ETRTO. And so, if your tire says, 140 on the sidewall, that means that on this steel test rim in a laboratory, it could do, 280.
Right.
And so I think, certainly when I was growing up, we were all taught, the higher that number on the sidewall, the better the tire, right? Because that's what you wanted. And if you really had a coach who knew something, he might tell you, hey, you can actually go above that number, right? Because that number is only a fraction of the actual number.
So it has nothing to do with ideal tire pressure at all. It's just kind of like a standards testing for it blowing off the rim and everything.
It is absolutely 100% a legal requirement by a testing and standards body. It almost couldn't have less to do with anything.
Right. Well, let's get to know.
Than it does, right?
Yeah. I've been influenced a lot by some of the stuff that Jan Heine has been talking about, saying that usually we associate, higher tire pressure with speed, just because it transmits high frequency vibration. And it sounds like you've found that too in your testing.
Those high frequency vibrations feel fast because our brains are not very good at perceiving speed. So it's sort of a classic proxy problem, right? That high frequency vibration is a proxy in your brain for speed, just like wind noise is a proxy for speed. But the reality is, humans we're not good at perceiving speed outright. I have a talk I do, and I always like to say that, this is why people still get hit by trains, right? and truly, because our eyes we're not set quite wide enough apart to accurately perceive velocity. We can be okay with training at distance, but we're terrible at velocity. And so, people see the train coming and they think, oh, it's not going that fast. And, you've just completely misjudged. All of us, myself included, up until probably 10 years ago, were thinking, oh, the high frequency vibration is fast. It's better. Mm-hmm. And I can feel it. It must be real.
So ideal tire pressure, lower than you would think.
Generally, yes. We like to joke. We've got this van, this coffee van that we take, a Mercedes Sprinter. When we built the van, we labeled it the inflation station. And the joke of the inflation station is that we take it to events and we spend probably 90% of our time deflating people's tires. Because they come up and they say, oh, give me 140. It's like, ma'am, you weigh 100 pounds. You don't, 140 is probably double what you actually need. And so, it's been a great learning experience for us to, I think, understand what people think is fast. And then it really, honestly, that even the professional athletes we work with, the pro teams that we work with, they're in the same boat, right? They feel the same things that we feel. And, I think we've learned a lot from trying to convince them to come down to reasonable pressures that we use to help, the rest of us come to reasonable pressures. And I think the one, I would say, phrase that we come to over and over again is to stop thinking about this high frequency thing being speed and seek smoothness. It's if it feels fast, it's probably not fast. and as you come down in your pressures, it's when it starts to feel smooth, that's when it's actually fast. And that's a pretty consistent thing. We've got there's probably a $40,000 data rig that we can hook up to a bike and send you out and actually test this with high accuracy. And I would say, 98, 99% of the time, it's when the rider starts to say like, oh yeah, that it doesn't feel fast anymore. As we're coming down in pressure, that's usually right about where it's fast.
So what's kind of like a ballpark number? So let's say someone comes in, they ask for 140, let's say they weigh like 150 and they're running 25, 28 millimeter tires.
You start to get into, and this is where it's hard to build an algorithm out for these things. Say you're 150, you're on a, 18-pound bike, you're on 25s, you probably come to me and you're running 120, and 120 is probably a pretty good pressure for you on like a concrete velodrome. But, in the real world, we're not on concrete velodrome surface. And so as soon as you get onto asphalt, those pressures start to fall. And I think one of the things that people forget, or they maybe don't think about, is even when a surface looks smooth and feels smooth, particularly on asphalt, it's got a lot of negative space in it. And I think that's, it may not have protrusions like bumps sticking up. The negative spaces in the surface force the tire to squirm around to maintain the contact patch that it needs to support the weight. And that's where things start to get really interesting, right? As the pressures go up, the contact patch gets smaller. But now as it runs over those negatives, the tire has to work extra hard to kind of make that space up. And this is one of the things that makes it so hard to develop an algorithm for, is that, you might say, oh, I have brand new pavement. And typically what we find is the wealthier an area you're in, the denser the new pavement will be, right? Because if as you spend more money, you're typically using finer stone particulates in the asphalt. And then as you get into areas where they're saving money, the stones get larger, the negative spaces get larger, and the pressure needs to come down. And so, it's like every year before the major races, I was a week in Europe before the Tour de France this year, and we look at the critical stages. And that's one of the things that we actually spend a lot of time looking at, right? Is, okay, it may look smooth to the human eye, but how much negative space is in that pavement? Because that can be a 15, 20 PSI difference.
Right.
And yet, at 10 feet away, you and I looking at it might go, yeah, that's about the same, right? But it's not.
Do you have a sense of like how would this apply to like a really wide tire, like a 650B by 48?
The hard thing is establishing sort of your baseline for you, and for the surface that you're on, right? So, typically, the laws of casing tension hold, and that is that, as the tire casing gets larger, right, the casing will have higher tension at the same pressure. But when you start to look at running over protrusions, like as bumps get smaller, the larger tires, they recruit the casing around the bump more efficiently, right? If you think of as the tire gets wider, its tangent angle to the ground becomes flatter. And as the tire gets wider, its diameter grows. And so you get this sort of double benefit of having this decreased tangent angle to the bump. And so, I might say, 36 PSI is on a 50C tire, or a 50 millimeter tire is the equivalent of, 100 PSI on a 25 millimeter tire, just picking a number.
Right.
But that's on a truly flat surface. But then when you look at the smaller the bumps get, the more efficient the larger tire gets, the softer it gets, and because it just takes less energy to deform over these tiny things. And so, I think that's one of the things, I love the word supple, right? That you love to use. And I think that in a way, supple to me is undamped spring rate, right? Supple is an undamped ability of something to deform and spring back over these small bumps. And the low damping is key, right? Because I think, if you take a crappy thick tire at the same size, at the same pressure, it will not be as supple. It might compress a similar amount, but it doesn't rebound as smoothly.
If someone wants to find their, ideal pressure, lots of variables involved, like what are, let's say, 3 or 4 steps that can be applied by anyone, anywhere to kind of find some kind of good tire pressure?
The big one, I would say, get a notebook, right? Start with a notebook and a pencil, which sounds like, oh, really? That sounds like a pain. But a notebook and a pencil, or a notes app on your phone and a camera are just hugely invaluable. And I mean, this is we go to work with Peter Sagan or whoever. This is literally how we do it with them. Right. And sort of pick your baseline pressure, pick what you think is there. And typically it's going to be, I would say, a little bit higher than probably what you really need. Mm-hmm. And, we recommend coming down in couple PSI increments or couple percent increments, depending on, obviously if you're, if you're starting at 100, a 5 PSI is a good number to drop. If you're starting at 30, 5 PSI is a lot, right? To drop. Start to bring it down. And, if you're, ride a loop so you can feel some consistency and, feel for the smoothness to come on. And, I would say, we generally say, keep going until you start to feel the cornering get a little bit vague. Mm-hmm. And that's typically like a PSI or two too far, right? You want the bike to corner predictably. The other one on truly smooth road, that point is probably a little below the efficiency, but you can also feel for bobbing, like pedal induced bobbing on the tire. That's typically a little bit below where kind of like the peak efficiency point would be. And then like once you start to bob or feel that vagueness, come back up a couple percent and you're honestly going to be pretty close to your sweet spot. And that, we could spend tens of thousands of dollars on equipment and, power meters and wind measuring devices, right, and little pitot tubes and all this stuff that we have, right? We can throw a ton of stuff at it. And honestly, I can probably writing it down, writing a lap, making notes, doing it again, right? Making notes. We can probably get you within a couple percent, right, of your optimal just based on that sort of repetitive note-taking modeling.
Would there be any X factors if, let's say, you were riding gravel or in or something like Paris-Roubaix, where like a big or like a decisive chunk of it is very not smooth?
Yeah.
Where do you balance, or where would you balance their tire pressure?
Yeah. So, Roubaix is my favorite, right? It's, I spent 3 years of my life trying to make a carbon wheel win at Roubaix. And what we ultimately discovered was we just needed to convince them to ride wider tires. So, like this year, Roubaix, we had wind out of the north. And if you know the course is, mostly north-south. But there's this kind of predominantly pavement section that goes west and then east. And so typically when the wind's out of the north, one of the big things that happens is attacks go in that east-west section as they try to break the race into echelons. And so it actually, when the wind's out of the north, it's sort of, in a way, you want to be a little bit on the higher side of the tire pressure, so that you can be in a better spot when the break happens, knowing it's going to come probably in that paved section. If the wind's out of the west or the east, it becomes a little bit of a different story. So, but yeah, I mean, we'll probably start 3 days ahead of time and tweak the guys in based on, what tires the sponsor's given them that year. This year, one of the sort of dirty secrets that we had was with the bikes going to disc brakes. A lot of the teams, or a couple of the teams we worked with, were riding, and I have to do the air quotes, 30s. If you put calipers on them, would really measure like 32, right? Well, that's a huge difference. Right. in what we can optimize for with the tire pressure. And so, that's one where I'd say, you might have a rider at 4.8 bar if we're optimizing for the cobbles, and maybe it's 5.0 if we're optimizing for the pavement, somewhere in that range. On a lighter rider, it's probably a little lower. The heavier riders, you might be slightly above it at that size. Now, similar to that, you take a race like Dirty Kanza, and it's typically more, what's your goal here? Survive, right? And finish. And so, if we're talking with Taylor Phinney or Ted King, the optimization point is going to be a little bit different than, if I were building for myself, right? Or for you or somebody who's
right.
trying to not die.
Right.
And so there, the thing that you're really after is, as I look at it, I want the softest pressure I can run that's not going to pinch flat me, right? Especially at a place like Kanza where you've got that sort of sharp flint. And you think of, one of the things that really kills tires at a place like Kanza is that the higher the tension in the casing, the easier it is to cut the casing, right? So you think of, I always describe it as, think of if I had like a mop head right here with all the dangly thing, and, you get a super sharp knife and you try to cut the threads of the mop, and if they're just dangling, you can't do it. Right. No matter how sharp your knife is, you can't do it. So if you wanted to cut them, what would you do?
You'd pull
right? You'd pull tension in it.
Right.
And the more tension you have in the, those strands, the easier they are to cut. And, that's sort of the perfect analogy for what happens in a place like Kanza where you've got that sharp flint that, the sidewall of your tire is typically like 3 plies, maybe 4, some of the thick ones, maybe 5, but of this sort of bias plied, crossed cotton or nylon. And as the air pressure goes up, you're just pulling ever more tension in there, right? And so the goal, for myself at a ride like Kanza is, okay, how do I balance not pinch flatting with not having enough casing tension in there that I can get that big sidewall gash? And, I would say from some of my experience, like a 650 B, 50 to 55 millimeter tire on a 160, 170 pound rider, you're probably optimally in the high 20s, 28, 27.
So it sounds like there's lots of benefits to a wider tire, especially in races like Roubaix, or just like for lots of people. What's the point of diminishing returns where a tire is too wide?
Depends how fast you're going, really. In pro racing, we have this thing that we work to called the rule of 105, and that's that your rim needs to be at least 105% the width of the tire, right? Or flip it on its head, the tire should be 95% of the rim width. And that's for aerodynamics, right? And so you think of the speeds that the Pro Tour guys are riding, that's a big deal, right? Violating the rule of 105, in the sprint at the end of Roubaix can cost you 25 watts, 30 watts. That's probably in a 250 meter sprint. That's probably a meter, right? That's right. A lot.
Yeah.
For the stuff that we're talking about here, gravel riding, gravel racing, the speeds are a lot slower. And so the aerodynamic penalties are just much, much less, right? Especially, we've got our big gravel bars, and we've got our, handlebar bag,
right.
And, the clothing we're wearing. I mean, the aero is just not the priority there. And so honestly, I would say wider just continues to be better on those surfaces. I mean, almost to the point of like, if you can fit it in your bike, it's what you should be riding on a rough surface, right? Because it's, if you're averaging 14 miles an hour, the aero penalties of that are pretty negligible. Between, call it a 50 and a 55, it's
right.
As an aerodynamicist, I would say, yeah, they're all bad. But it's a nuance within the bad, it's, right. And of course we could do the calculations, call it 100 meters and 100 kilometers. Who cares?
Right.
Who cares?
Yeah.
I don't care. So yeah, I generally say when the going gets rough, the biggest tire you can fit in the bike is going to be the biggest benefit. The key really being the high efficiency tire, right? Because there are, not all 50s are equivalent. And I think that's one of the things that the industry's now going to have to kind of reconcile, is that we've been on this wider is better trend, but you can look at some of the data out there or do some testing on some of the tires, and, they are far from all being created equal.
So where does the efficiency come in the tire once it gets that wide?
So really, you're looking at the casing thickness, the tread thickness, and the construction materials. The casing losses in a tire are due to this thing we call hysteresis, right? And hysteresis is essentially that the materials behave differently one direction than they behave in the other. And the analogy I always use for this is the Tempur-Pedic mattress commercial, right? And so they take the hand and they push it into the mattress, and then when they lift it out, the handprint stays, right? That's a hysteresis. So if I push it down at one speed and then I lift my hand out and it stays compressed, all of that energy is being lost to heat, right? And it's slowly rebounding back. That's a terribly inefficient construction for something like a tire. What we ideally want in a tire is I push it down and it comes back exactly as it went down, and there's no internal friction lost to convert that movement into heat. And so that's where, if you look at something like the highest efficiency track tires, we go to work on like an hour record with somebody, and Vittoria will make them these ridiculous, I mean, you just want to touch them, track tires where there's no latex in the sidewall. And so you have this silk construction, 2 plies. And so it's 2 bias plies, like this. And there's no latex holding it together. You can actually kind of spread it apart and see the inner tube in there.
Oh, wow.
And what that gives you is, as the tire is compressed at the bottom near the contact patch, there's just that much less material to rub and make that friction, right, to give you those heat losses. The other way, and I think we've got a video on our website to look at it, is different raw materials have their own hysteresis, right? And so if I've got a video where I take a ball made of latex and a ball made of butyl, and we drop them, and the latex ball comes back, bounces like 85% of the drop height, and the butyl ball bounces to like 20% of the drop height. Right? And so what that's telling you is that, that during that impact, when it's compressed and bouncing back, it's losing 80% of its energy, right? So that's just a terrible, highly lossy, or high loss coefficient, as the engineers would say. And so you think of, as your wheel is rolling, you think the tire right in front of the contact patch is, its natural shape. And then as it comes under the contact patch and it compresses, right, it's being deformed to make the contact patch, and then it's springing back. And the way that the loss is happening is all this energy is being put in to smush it. And then how much of that energy is it returning on the backside? The thicker the tire, the cheaper the materials, the more butyl, right? The thicker the casing. I mean, there's a million factors. But if you were to draw those out as force vectors, you see that essentially there's kind of all these forces being put in to squish it. And then the forces that are coming out of it as it rebounds are much smaller. And so as we're making a highly efficient tire, a supple tire, we're basically trying to recapture that energy and let it, spring back. And so that's where you get to, latex inner tubes are just way, way faster than butyl inner tubes. If you build a tire and use latex in the sidewall rather than a butyl, it's much more efficient. As the treads get thinner, there's just less material there to squish. Right. Same thing with knobs. The knobs squish around on hard pavement, and you hear them. Right. And I think that's another thing that we, even at the pro level, we train our athletes. Like, if you can hear it, right, it's a problem. Right. Nobody goes to the electronics store and buys a 1-watt stereo system. Right. Because power equals sound. Right. The more wattage in your stereo, the louder you can play it. Well, the same thing in the old days, you'd put that 3-spoke wheel in that narrow fork and you roll it up to speed and it's going, right? And people say, oh, that's the sound of fast. You're like, no, that's the sound of watts just shooting out into the air. If you can hear it, it's not good. If you can hear your tire going right and making all these terrible noises,
right,
it takes energy to make that sound. The supple topic is exciting for me because it's one of the rare things in this sport, right, and in technology, where it's sort of a win on every single level, right? It's more comfortable, it's more efficient, right? It's better grip, it's less fatiguing on the body. I mean, there's, when you really get it right, there's no negative to it. And I think of pretty much everything else we deal with in the sport. I do tons of, wind tunnel and kind of all these other optimizations, and typically there's always a trade-off, right? Like, and I can put you in this position and make you a minute faster.
It's really uncomfortable.
Yeah, well, and typically there's your power comes down, right? I mean, the most aero position is usually not the most powerful, but because of the way the trade-offs work, it's typically better to make you 10% more aero if it costs you 10% watts.
Right.
You're usually faster that's usually a faster setup. And then the comfort, I've always just said I don't want to hear it.
Right. So in terms of the steps to find ideal tire pressure, get a notebook
And a pencil.
Be cognizant of what you're running, write it down. And it sounds like what we're going for is smooth.
Start where you are, seek smooth, and find. The key is finding that. I talk a lot about Icarus with my riders, right? People remember the Icarus story as don't fly too close to the sun, right? Mm-hmm. But when you really read the story, what Daedalus tells Icarus is, don't fly too close to the sun or your wings will melt. But don't fly too close to the sea or your wings will, load up with water, right, and you'll drown. And so, these are for me, one of the most exciting types of problems is optimization, because, the answer will be found by the person who spends the energy to understand it and learn it, right? Anybody can buy lighter stuff, right? Mm-hmm. Weight is a minimization problem. You just spend more to make it lighter. Mm-hmm. And so we have these three types of problems: maximize, minimize, optimize. And the optimize is typically where, in this sport at least, there's so much science, so much data. A lot of the maximize, minimize, that's kind of all done. But the optimize is still hanging out there because it usually takes a notebook, right, and a pencil. And as soon as I say a notebook and a pencil, people roll their eyes and go, "Oh, I don't want to do that." But the exciting thing is, I can find you. I would say the average pro athlete we work with, we will find more watts through tire pressure optimization than you will get with like a full bike ceramic bearing upgrade, and it's essentially free, other than your time, right? And so we can make you faster, more comfortable, right? Better grip. Your tires will last longer. That's another thing that people don't think about. But the overpressure tires, the rubber starts to fail and crack. And so if your tires have little micro cracks in them, that's a huge sign that you're running too much pressure. Right. But yes, so get your notebook, get your pencil.
So do a lap. Or do a couple laps. You're looking for smooth, kind of reduce it, in terms of in like percentages.
Yeah, and this is one, not to plug our product overly, but I think in my story, my obsession with pumps really came from the Cancellara-Roubaix project, where we just couldn't repeat our data, right? We would find something that works and then we'd break the wheel, or it would go slower, and we realized that the repeatability of the pumps. We had 3 pumps on the Saxo team truck, and there was a 12 PSI difference in them at the same pressure. And we didn't know which one to trust. And so starting about 2009, we started buying these, $500 gauges and hot rodding these pumps to have repeatability. And so ever since then, I carry around this little thing. We carry it around in a little Pelican 9mm handgun case, and we call it the Truth. And it's a 0.1% accuracy gauge. If you look online, there's a bunch of pictures of me with EF and Bora and a couple other teams at Roubaix this year using the Truth. But it's a big thing, because typically you'll find repeatability of the pressure gauge you have access to is probably plus or minus 3 to 5 psi. And so that's the thing where you just need to be keeping good notes. And if you come across a data point that you don't trust, let the air out, pump it back up, right? Try to repeat it in a way to find if you've got those gauge errors in there, because that's the one thing about this that will drive you nuts. Chasing your tail if 100 psi isn't always 100 psi.
The Bluetooth pump, is that pretty accurate, or in terms of?
Yeah, so Viaggio, the Bluetooth pump is pretty cool. That all of our digital sensor technology is actually pretty interesting. So a digital sensor has a nonlinear, I can kind of draw this with my finger, it kind of makes this like S curve. And so what the gauge manufacturers do is they fit a straight line to this curve. And if you look at the way you buy gauges, you'll buy 0 to 30, 0 to 60, 0 to 100. Well, that's typically the same sensor, and they are just changing where the curve is fit along the S. And so what we did is we went to our sensor company, Wika in Germany, and said, okay, we want to custom fit this to put all of the accuracy kind of down in these lower pressures and then let it drift at the higher pressures. Because really, at 200 psi on a track tire, how important is 1 or 2 psi? It's much less important than half a psi is at 20, right? And so, the way we've got the curve fit on our digital technology, you are half psi accurate up to about 75 or 80, and then it begins to drift. And so we're the most accurate pressure down at those low pressures, and then at 100% or 100 psi, it's 1% accurate. At 200 psi, it's 2% accurate. Again, because at 200 psi, 2% accuracy is plus or minus 4.
So it's accurate where it counts.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, if you're trying to hit 23.5,
right.
We will hit that. We will be accurate within 0.5, and the repeatability is like 0.05, right? And so that's that's the other kind of thing that we forget about, right? There's accuracy, which is, was used the dartboard analogy. Accuracy is like, how close to the bullseye are you, right? And then there's repeatability, which is how close is every dart to every other dart. And that's called precision typically. And so people, I think, oftentimes confuse those. And so, I know there's a number of products out that say high precision gauge. Well, it can be wrong as hell, right? It's just wrong as hell the same way every time. And that doesn't necessarily, make it all that much better. Although, in this case, use the same gauge your wrong gauge, your inaccurate gauge, can still help you find a good tire pressure for you if it's repeatable.
Right. If it's inaccurate the same way all the time.
Right. And then the problem is just when you travel, right? Which is one of the problems, again, we have with like the pro teams that, if you've got 10 pumps across 5 trucks in Europe and the gauges are all different from each other, and a rider's setup is, X rear, Y front, well, every time they travel somewhere, they're getting something different, and then the results are, and so this is where, you can see why people, I think, struggle to want to optimize in this area, right? It's quite simple to say, hey, for $500, I can give you this oversized pulley system for your derailleur, and you put it on, and you never measure it, and you have no idea if it's actually any faster,
right?
And then you never think about it, but every time you look at your bike, it's like, oh man, this thing is fast because I've got that giant pulley system on there. That's easy, right? And what we're talking about is hard, but when you really look at the data, I mean, the results, optimal tire pressure can be 5 times the benefit of a giant oversized ceramic pulley system on your derailleur, right? Yeah. I mean, these can be big savings from a wattage perspective. And then for those of us who don't race, which is pretty much all of us, you've got the comfort and the fatigue thing, right? Which is, for me at my age, in the riding that I do, which is not much, that's a way bigger deal, right?
Yeah.
I'd way rather have, the comfort and the fatigue reduction than the speed. Although the upside is typically the fastest pressure is also the most comfortable.
Right. So I want to thank Josh for joining us in this super deep bike tire nerd out. He's super knowledgeable, really articulate. And if you enjoyed them in this interview, you'll probably enjoy him in the other podcast that he helps co-host. It's called Marginal Gain. So it's a little bit more racing focused, but they do lots of deep dives into super fascinating topics. I think you will enjoy that as well. I will put a link to that in the description below. And as always, guys, keep the supple side down.